Okay, we continue our daily Gemara. We are on Kuf Ches Amud Aleph 108a, and we are continuing our discussion in trying to understand the generation of the flood, what was with their behavior, what led to their behavior, and the consequences thereof, and what was God's thought process, as it were, in throughout. So we are on the line begins with the word Be'enei Hashem, and the third word is V'yinachem, is little Chav Gimel, indicating the verse. So the verse reads at the end of the first parsha, then the Bereshis, before Noach, before it gets into the actual flood. The verse reads, V'yinachem Hashem, and God regretted, as it were, Ki asa Adam ba'aretz, that He made man on the earth, and therefore, because of the degenerate behavior, He led to therefore decided He's going to destroy them, with the exception of Noach. And the next parsha, the next portion, goes on to describe the actual flood. Now, this word Vayinachem, which I just translated as God regretted or reconsidered, is the often simple translation, but the Gemara is going to offer another translation as well, and it's going to be very interesting how the Gemara comes to this. So first the Gemara says this: Ki Asir Avdimi, when Avdimi arrived from Eretz Yisrael to where we are in Babylonia, in Babel, Amar, he said, Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God says, Yafa Asisi, I did well. Vayinachem, and God reconsidered, God regretted, which is usually translated as regretted, actually is in the positive sense. God saying, I did well. In what manner? Shetikantilem kvaris ba'aretz, that I prepared burial places in the earth. Meaning to say that I did well to prepare this idea of death, because that puts an end to negative behavior. So it's not necessarily it's bad in the sense that God is ending the lives of these people, but God speaking, His reconsidering is actually in the good sense. He's like considering the pros of what He did in preparing eventual death. In the words of the Gemara, He prepared graves for them in the earth, and that it puts an end to the wickedness. So my mashma, where do we pick up this idea that the word Vayinachem has a positive connotation and not just regret? Because Ksiv Hacha, it says here, Vayinachem Hashem, we use the term, and God Vayinachem Hashem, and God reconsidered. Now how do we get that this means positive? Ksiv Hacha, it says there, with respect to many verses later, chapters later, when the brothers of Yosef, the children of Yaakov, come to their brother Yosef in Egypt, and they're obviously, when they find out that he's Yosef, they're nervous that he's going to take revenge on them, and he tells them, and he comforted them. He spoke to their hearts, saying, "Don't worry, I'm going to feed you. This is why this is a good thing that this happened. Hashem sent me so I can feed you, etc." So you see here from this word Vayinachem, and God, and using the same word Vayinachem, but not to mean regret in the negative sense, and that he's unhappy with what happened, but rather that he's happy with what happened. He's happy that he came down to Egypt so he can feed his brothers, which is interesting that the two words we're using, on the simple level, it's a word association. The word Vayinachem is used for Yosef to describe that he's happy with what happened, and therefore we're saying the same thing here when God uses the word Vayinachem. He's happy with what He did, and that He created graves for them to end wickedness. But it's interesting in that they're actually the opposites. Whereas what God is happy with in the first Vayinachem, when it comes to the flood, is God is happy that He prepared graves for them and putting an end to wickedness. And Yosef is the reverse. He's happy that he went down to Egypt so that he can feed and keep his brothers alive. So it's almost as if the interpretive verse is the antidote to the verse that we're learning from. So the Vayinachem, the comforting of Yosef, and where he's happy with the negative that happened because it comes out into a positive where he can feed his brothers, is almost like the antidote to the other Vayinachem, where God is happy that it prepared death in the end, which would follow what we said earlier in previous class, that the big sin of that generation was thievery. And here Yosef is the reverse, where he has all this food that he could legally keep as his own, and yet sharing it with others. That's almost like the antidote to the flood. And a similar thing is going to happen in the next reading as well. So Vayikad Amri, others read it, not that Rav Dimi came and said Vayinachem is that God was happy with what he did in creating graves because it puts an end to wickedness, but rather, God says, I didn't do well. He regrets, keeping the literal meaning. I regret that I created graves for them in that they are an end. Why? Because if I were to keep them around, they may actually do teshuvah. They may actually change their ways. So it's not a good thing that I put an end to their life. This is what God's saying. Now, when we come to this idea of Vayinachem, God's reconsidering is that he's unhappy with what he did. It says here, Vayinachem, the verse reads Vayinachem, which we translate as regret. In this version, it's the negative sense. God is unhappy with what he did, as it were, in creating an end because they should live longer so that they can do teshuvah. It says elsewhere, this is a reference to when Moshe pleads the case. When the Jews sin with the golden calf and Moshe argues with God to defend them, God then says, and God regretted on the negative that he said he would do to the people, because God said he was going to destroy the people and restart the whole project with Moshe himself. And Moshe came, as it were, pleaded with God and changed God's mind. So God says he regrets. The verse says that God regretted that which he said he would have done to the people. So it's interesting. It's a similar... So again, the simple reading is that we're just a word association. In the same way over there, the word Vayinachem means God was unhappy with what he did, and that he said he was going to destroy the people. So likewise here, Vayinachem, God is regretting, he's unhappy with what he did in creating an end for these people, because hope they may have, had they lived longer, they may have been able to do teshuvah. At least that's where Rashi understands the Gemara. So it's interesting again how the verse from which we interpret is the antidote to the verse that we are interpreting, right? The antidote to this idea that God's saying, I regret having put an end to these wicked people because perhaps they would have done teshuvah, actually happens with those who sin at the golden calf. They sinned, and God wanted to destroy them, which is what he did to the actual people at the flood. But God says, no, I'm not going to do that. And as a result, the Jews actually do teshuvah. They get God's forgiveness. And as a result of that, we have Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement. And we have, and following that, in Rashi's view of the order of events in the Chumash, we have the Mishkan built where God's presence resides, demonstrating God's forgiveness. So it's quite interesting that on the literal level of the Gemara, it's just a word association. Either that the word Vayinachem is, in the good sense, God's happy he put an end to the people, and we learn that translation of the word Vayinachem from the fact that Yosef does the opposite in feeding his brothers and keeping them alive and not stealing. And likewise, in the other interpretation, in that Vayinachem means God is unhappy that he put an end because he would have been better had they lived longer to do teshuvah. That actually plays out when God says he's going to destroy the Jewish people after having sinned, and God says, no, God regrets having said that I'm ending them, and actually allowing them to live longer and allowing them to do teshuvah. So it's interesting that the interpreted verses are like an antidote to the flood. Now the Talmud goes on to discuss Noach himself and his state in the world. And of course, the lines the Gemara is about to tell us are very famously quoted in the first Rashi in Parshas Noach. The verse reads in the opening lines of Parshas Noach, of the portion of Noach. Ela told us Noach. This is the lifetime, this is the chronicles of Noach. Noach ish tzaddik. Noach was a righteous man. Tomim hoya, he was wholesome, b'dorosav, in his generation. So Rabbi Yochanan says, b'dorosav, he was wholesome in his generation. The verse reads, and he was wholesome in his generation. So Rabbi Yochanan highlights the word in his generation. B'dorosav, comparative to his generation, he was a tzaddik, he was wholesome. But not in some other time. Actually, Rashi in his comment says, comparing it specifically to the generation of Avraham, had he lived in the generation of Avraham, he would be a nobody, he would be a regular person. So it's only because of how degenerate his people were, and he maintained this sense of non-degenerate behavior, that we say he is wholesome, but only comparative to his generation. Not to be, in other generations, he would have just been an ordinary person. That's Rabbi Yochanan. Perek Chelek, Omar says, B'dorosav, in his generation he was wholesome. Kolshken, how much more so b'doros achayim in other generations. Meaning to say, if he was able to stay wholesome, even in a generation of people who are completely degenerate, how much more so had he been put in a generation that was in of itself good, how much greater he would have been. So two readings of the verse which says that he was wholesome in his generation. Like Rashi says, Yesh der Samar, so that those that expound it Lignai in the negative, that only in his generation he was wholesome. Had he been in a different generation, he would have been an ordinary fellow. But the Reish Lakish interprets it the Shvach in a praise, in that even in his generation he was wholesome. How much more so had he been placed in a generation that was actually righteous? How much more so he would have been of a great tzaddik nature. Now, what's interesting is that even though, if I'm not mistaken, Rashi, the Chumash there does not mention who says what, but here the Gemara says it's Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Now, what's interesting is, we've talked about the story of Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. It's a very fascinating story that ends in tragedy, actually. But this, at least the beginning part of the story is that Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish are brother-in-laws. Rabbi Yochanan was a great scholar, always, and a very good-looking man, as the Gemara tells us, actually. And he was a very good-looking person, and he had a very beautiful sister, which, after a whole series of events, which is quite interesting, but not for now, Reish Lakish, who initially was a thief, actually, interesting, again, this connection to thievery of Noach, was a thief, was a bandit, and eventually was convinced by Rabbi Yochanan to marry Rabbi Yochanan's sister, do teshuvah, and Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish became chavrusis. So they're very often cited as juxtaposed opinions. Rabbi Yochanan says this, Reish Lakish says that, because they're chavrusis, they were study partners and brother-in-laws. The story ends in tragedy, where Reish Lakish eventually dies early, and Rabbi Yochanan mourns him to a great degree, to the point that it caused his own health to deteriorate. But the reason why I'm sharing this is because Rabbi Yochanan, who was always righteous, he highlights this idea that Noach was only special in his generation. Had he been in other generations, he would have been a nobody. So on one level, you can say, it kind of mirrors Rabbi Yochanan's experience. He was always a good person. And therefore, to him, he sees the value of someone who goes exceptionally beyond just being a good person, irrespective of the surroundings, because he never dealt with a negative surrounding. He was always the tzaddik. A little deeper, perhaps, the lesson that we take from this version of Rabbi Yochanan is that one should not pat themselves on the back and say, well, look around me, people are much worse than me, so I'm okay. The person is to strive to get even better. And maybe that's what Rabbi Yochanan is saying. He grew up in a wholesome environment and remained righteous in that way, and he's reminding himself, well, maybe it's only because I grew up this way. And therefore, the fact that I happen to be a little better than other people shouldn't be considered anything. I have to push myself to be even better. Whereas Reish Lakish, who started out in a negative surrounding, he appreciates this idea of someone who exemplifies himself even amongst negativity. And therefore, he sees the fact that Noach is wholesome in his generation as an amazing thing. And his primary focus is to encourage the Baal Teshuvah, the one who may find himself in a negative situation. Whereas Reish Lakish is telling him, just like Noach, you can climb out of that. And moreover, those who aren't doing so well, Reish Lakish can appreciate and say, it's not their fault. It's true we need to encourage them to get better, but maybe it's their surrounding that's causing them to be that way. And therefore the fact that Noach remained wholesome in his generation is worthy of the most amazing praise. So their backgrounds, of Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish's background, actually give context, as it were, to their opinions in how they view Noach. Whether saying it's only comparative that he's great, or even in this surrounding, he is great. The one who always grew up the one who always grew up in a wholesome, righteous environment, versus Reish Lakish, who is the Baal Teshuvah. Now the Gemara gives a example, a parable for each of these two views. Rabbi Chanina says, Mashal Rabbi Yochanan. What's a parable for Rabbi Yochanan? Rabbi Yochanan who says that Noach was only righteous in his generation, but had he been in a different generation, he would have been a regular fellow. To what can this be compared? To a barrel of wine that was sitting in a cellar full of vinegar. When you approach the wine surrounded by vinegar, smells beautiful. But if you take the wine out of its cellar and you put it into a wine cellar, if you take the wine out of the cellar full of vinegar and you put it into a cellar with other wine, its smell is not distinguishable because it's amongst wine. So likewise, Noach would have been not distinguished as so great had he been in a generation of great people as well, or wholesome people as well, And it's only because of the negativity of the generation that we can distinguish Noach as a wholesome person. Amar Rabbi now provides a parable for Reish Lakish's reading of Noach as being someone righteous even in his generation, and how much more so had he been in a different. Amar Rabbi says, Mashal Reish Lakish, Lama Davar, a parable for Reish Lakish's reading, to be compared to what? L'tzaluchish shel plaitin, to a plate or a jug of fragrant perfume. Sheisu monachas, that was lying b'makamat tinofos, in a place that's disgusting. B'mkoima, in its place, when you encounter a perfume amongst bad, foul-smelling things, reicha noidef, its smell is pleasant. The kosh came much more so b'makam aboisim, if you were to take that fragrant plate and put it amongst perfume, then the other perfumes would actually enhance that, make it smelling even better. Likewise, Noach, he was amazing in his generation. How much more so had he been in a generation of good people, he would have been even greater. Now the Gemara gets to analyzing a little bit more about the destruction itself. So the verse reads, and God destroyed, God eliminated, or all of the existence that's on the earth. So comments the Gemara, man sinned, what did animals do wrong? Now, even though the Gemara said earlier that the animals were also crossbreeding amongst other animals, either this version of the Gemara doesn't agree with that reading, or it could be they have no free choice, and it was man's doing in that man was causing all this crossbreeding. So why is animals being held accountable, is what the Gemara is asking here. So it was taught in the name of Rabbi Shua ben Karcha, Marshal Adam, by way of example, the person, he created literally a chuppah is just a canopy, but a chuppah means more than that. He created a whole wedding feast, and maybe even more than just a wedding feast. Saved up money for a dowry and whatnot. Lebnoi, for his son, who's going to get married. And he created all kinds of things for a feast and a celebration, and he has a whole wedding planned. Meis Benoi, his son dies, Nebach. The chassan dies. Upizes chupasai. And he go to mommy, please, Chaim. And he takes all the stuff and all the money that he has and splurges it and says, Omar, he says, did I do any of the stuff except for my son? That's why I invested all this time and effort. But now that my son has passed, what do I need to hold this whole celebration for? What do I need this canopy? What do I need the dowry for? And he's willing to splurge it all and waste it all. In his distress, in the fact that the one for whom he prepared all this, his son, has perished, God forbid. So continues Rabbi Yeshua ben Karcha. Apakadosh Baruch Hu, so to God. Omar says, Klum barasi behema b'chaya. Did I create animals and this whole world? What did I create it for? El b'shvil adam, I only created it for man. Now that man is sinning, what do I need animals in a world for? So it's not that the animals sinned and that's why they're getting punished, but rather because the whole world is there for the Jew and for the human being. Eventually, after Matan Torah, the Jew becomes the center of that. But at this point in time, I created everything. God says I created everything for man, and man's misbehaving. What's the point of everything? The purpose, the focal point of creation, is a waste. So it's not as if if I got rid of man, now I have what? A world of purposelessness. The Gemara goes on to say, that the verse reads, all that which is on dry land died. And if the Gemara derives, but not the fish in the ocean. Tomorrow we'll get involved into more of Noach's relationship to the people around him. But I just want to make one final comment on this idea. That the fish survived, specifically, and those in the earth, animals on the earth died, and connect that with the previous statement in that God says the purpose of everything was for man, and if man's misbehaving, what's the point of it all? So we know from Chassidus that the world of the ocean, the maritime life in the ocean, is compared to a kind of life that is submerged in its source of life, right? Fish were created from the water, and they remain within and submerged in their source of life. Man was created from the earth, from dust of the earth, and we walk around upon the earth. Now what this symbolizes is that the world of dry land symbolizes a world that sees itself independent of its source of life, independent of God. Whereas fish in the sea, dogim shebayam, we've talked about this once here before with respect to ayin hara and why that's related to fish. But fish in the sea symbolize a kind of life that is submerged in the source of life, a life that is aware of its source of life, of the creator of Hashem. And therefore, perhaps, the destruction only happens on dry land because in this disconnect, in this lack of feeling and being connected to our source of life, to God, is where the beginning of this misbehavior comes. Whereas in the ocean, in a kind of life where one is submerged in this truth that God's the only reality and that God's the source of life, over there there's no destruction. Over there there's only continued life. And this connects to this idea that the entire world is created for man. Because the choice, the ability to choose between a life that is disconnected from Hashem, like dry land, and a life that is connected to Hashem, is only given to man. Everything else that exists in this world is only the context in which man makes that choice. The entire world does exactly what God wants. Whether it presents as negative or it presents as positive, it has no free choice and it's doing exactly what Hashem wants. The only anomaly is man, and specifically the Jew, who has the free choice to decide, am I going to be like creatures who walk on dry land, feeling disconnected from its source, feeling disconnected from Hashem? Or do I choose to feel to live like the fish in the ocean, who feel submerged and connected to its source of life, Hashem? And when the man, and when the Jew specifically, makes that choice, then the entire world comes and is elevated in that way. Because the only reason why God invested his divine energy to create the world is for that choice that the man, specifically Jew, will do. And therefore when man and when a Jew makes that choice, it elevates with it the entire world, for whom it was created to begin with, for which purpose it was created to begin with. Have a wonderful day, and I hope you're all being safe, and I hope you're all doing well, and God willing, we'll continue more tomorrow.